Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us to Ripple's Algorithmic Justice webinar series. Today, we're really lucky to have this exceptionally creative duo with us. Julia Stoyanovich is an assistant professor of computer science and engineering and of data science at NYU. She leads the Data Responsibly project and teaches interdisciplinary courses on responsible data science. Julia has really been a bridge between the CS and legal communities. I can say this from personal experience that I'm really grateful for. And so she's been helping legal scholars to understand machine learning and especially ranking algorithms, and also helping engineers and CS scholars understand legal concepts of liability, responsibility, due process, and equal protection. Falaa Arif Khan is a scientist and an artist, and she's joining us from India. And she's been working on ethical machine learning in industry and academia. And she started Machine Learnist Comics, which are online scientific comics about the AI landscape. I'll just kick this off, and just to remind you, you can put your questions in Q&A, and we'll have a chance to take them at the end. So one of the reasons I'm so happy to have this conversation and to introduce their work, Julia's and Falaa's work, to our broader communities is that AI ethics are hard to understand and to advocate for. I think at this point, it's pretty well known to everyone on this webinar that employment, housing, policing, and other algorithms can be unfair and inscrutable. And it's pretty well known that the creators of these algorithms are not diverse, and both the data inputs into the models that they create and the modeling objectives themselves tend to perpetuate unjust systems, or at least they often do. But the details are all rather murky for people affected by these systems, for people studying these systems, for those who would regulate or otherwise hold these systems accountable. And that is why it's so amazing that Julia and Falaa are working not only on the research and in the solution space, but also in the public communication space, so that we can all become more fluent with these systems that control and will increasingly control so many aspects of our lives. So with that, why don't we just start with an introduction, and I'll turn it over to you, Falaa, and maybe we can, Julia, if you wanna share just the graphic image of what we're going to be talking about. Falaa, how did you and Julia come to start this project?
Sure. So my background essentially is I've been drawing for about the last 10 years. And early in 2020, I started just making scientific comics. So scientific comics is something that I had just started making. And the first volume was a lot about the gold rush mentality in ML and about ML fairness. So I sort of cold emailed Julia. The second part of that story is that I was supposed to go to NYU for grad school, which is why I was really looking forward to working with her. So when those two sort of worlds collided, she had this brilliant idea of doing a data responsibly comic. So she has this really beautiful, exactly like you said in her introduction, this bridge between CS, law, ethics, policy course at NYU. So we thought we'd structure it around the same kind of issues that course is dealing with. So that's kind of how Data Responsibly Comics started. The one that you're seeing here is volume 1. We're super excited at the response we've gotten and how much we honestly learned while making it. So we're definitely continuing, and hopefully we'll have volume 2 out as well soon.
Well, let me ask you, you mentioned gold rush mentality. Can you just say something about that?
Sure. So the comic I'm referring to is called Meet AI. I'll drop a link in the chat in a bit. So essentially, it was a lot about how existing incentive structures in academia promotes impactful sounding research as opposed to impactful research. So a lot of that comic delves into what most people in academia have identified as problems, but those messages don't propagate across. So as a young researcher who was trying to get into the field, it was important that when I heard about these issues and understood these issues, I felt like people at university and while they were just entering the field also needed to hear about it. And that's kind of why I made the first comic. And the way the gold rush mentality is presented in the first comic is it's kind of like Jenga, where if you're setting the base with bloated results and sort of hype research, the researchers who come in will build on that, right? And that's a shoddy foundation. So I'll drop a link to that in the comic, but essentially the gold rush mentality, what the one that I refer to was the incentive structure in academia, especially machine learning today, that's linking with the hype in the media and the public perception of this technology. But I'll drop a link.
Julia, did you want to add to that?
Maybe just very quickly, and before I start answering the question, I want to say, Ellen, just how delighted I am to be in this conversation specifically with you, because you are one of my mentors in this field. So a few years ago, as I was just getting started, coming from my computer science background, you were so generous with your time, and I really am just so happy to hear from you that you appreciate the work. I couldn't figure this out. Yeah, so it's been an absolute pleasure working with Fala. And one thing that I want to say, just so I don't forget, is that I think that it's very important for us to be bringing humor into this conversation. And this is what a comic can do for us, right? Because technology is intimidating. Ethics is extremely intimidating. And when you take these in combination, it just becomes impossible for us to productively think about these topics. And so when you have a platform like a comic book, you can joke about it. You can be human about it, right? This is really the kind of this differentiator between us and machines, is that we have a sense of humor. And so that's why I really am so happy that Fala approached me. And I think that this is a perfect platform. And I'm really glad to see that Fala is very productive. She is also working with others, releasing other types of comics on this topic. And I hope that others in the community will also pick this up. It's really fun. It's just really, really awesome to be doing this.
Well, I want you to show us a little bit of the humor. And I want to say to students on this webinar, this is a great example of taking initiative. So Fala took this initiative and she approached Julia, and here we have this really productive collaboration. So maybe we can see how you display algorithmic bias, which is something that we talk a lot about in the law school.
Right, so let me go to that page. So this is actually one of my favorite pieces of this narrative that I was thinking through and I was putting into words, but now that I also have images to go along with it, I feel like whenever I speak about this, it lands much better. So when we talk about bias in algorithms, one of the first things that everybody notices, of course, is that in many cases, this is pre-existing bias that exhibits itself in the data on which these algorithms then operate. So they could learn from that data, or even if there is no learning, if it's a rule-based algorithm, right, it still is going to be making or helping people make decisions based on the data that it has before it. And so the way that we speak about this is that data is a mirror reflection of the world. And when data is biased, what we mean by that is that this reflection is somehow distorted. And a couple of important points here are that this distortion could be because the mirror itself is distorted. So it's taking a kind of a distorted picture. But another interpretation is that even if the mirror were perfect, the world could be distorted instead. And so most likely what we observe and what we denote as biased data is that these distortions compound. It is both the case that we cannot measure the world perfectly by this instrument that we call data, and also that the world itself is imperfect. And a data set cannot tell us, this reflection, it cannot tell us whether it's distorted and for what reason. And so I think that it's helpful for us to keep in mind the limitations of observation, the limitations of the scientific method when we talk about fixing bias in algorithms or fixing bias in the data. The first thing that we have to do here is postulate a value system. And then consistently with that clearly postulated value system, we can say, here are the kinds of interventions that are going to make things better. And another thing that we also show here, and this is at the bottom, is that it does sometimes help to change the data to improve things in the short run. So if you think that your data is such that it misrepresents abilities of African-American women, for example, as they apply to college, you can try to apply correction to that data set and to admit people from that demographic group in higher proportion. thus enacting affirmative action. But fixing the reflection only takes you so far, right? You actually have to work much, much harder to go and reflect these changes, to reflect corrections on the world itself, not just on the data. And it's up to people to decide what's right and to decide how to make these corrections.
Can I just ask you, just for in case we have people who aren't familiar with these terms, you mentioned rule-based algorithms and machine learning algorithms. Can you just say what those are?
Yes, and thank you for this question. So I'm hoping that soon we will also have a chance to release, if not a series, then at least a comic book in which we will speak to members of the public, to folks who are not necessarily technical. So this comic in particular is for either current or aspiring data scientists. So it does assume some level of familiarity with these topics, but we also have a narrative that is already visual as well, in which we use baking sourdough bread as a metaphor to explain algorithms, data, and decisions. And so a rule-based algorithm would be one where you write out the recipe precisely for how to bake that sourdough bread. What do you do, in what order, what ingredients you get, how much of each, how do you mix, how long you bake, etc. And so if you know these rules ahead of time, you can write them down. And every time, presumably, you'll get the same type of a sourdough bread out. And then these algorithms that involve learning are such that they allow us to maybe not start from the rules or not have complete rules available, but rather try to bake bread and then look at the outcome and say, is it chewy on the inside? Is it crusty on the outside? Is it tasty? Thumbs up or thumbs down? So these are the kinds of decisions that then humans bring in. And then from this combination of input data and the process that you tried and the various parameters and the output and the judgments on the output, an algorithm can learn the rules. And this is essentially the distinction.
Yeah. So so I wanted to ask before we leave bias. I mean, one of the things that I thought was so great about this work is that in addition to sort of race and gender bias, which have, I think, been at the forefront of our discussions of algorithmic bias and sort of map on to legal categories of protected classes. And so I think that's why it has been sort of, it's in that area that the early collaborations between law scholars and data scientists has taken place. But one of the things that you and Fala draw out is the ableism bias of both algorithms and data collection. And so, you know, what I struggle with in my work is that, you know, sometimes there's a danger of surveillance and being overly visible to data collection, right? And then sometimes there's the danger in being undervisible because you get underrepresented. And so, you know, I think if you could say something about how ableism works and may exacerbate discrimination in that area. And also, so that's point one, but also, you know, in law, we've just experienced this sort of traumatic experience with the bar and various ways that students taking the bar are surveilled for the purposes of that assessment. And what that's raised to the surface is, in general, kind of course, there was the famous debacle in England with the A-level exams, the college university entrance exams there. And in all these cases, one of the things that's happening is there is bias, not so much necessarily against protected classes, although that's also an issue, but there's bias, sort of a normativity bias about how you're expected to sit for an exam. And so if you're someone who moves around a lot or has eye motions that are different, right, which I think you do talk about, then there's this fear and actually a reality that you are going to be disadvantaged in these machine learning algorithms, which have a sort of normativity bias.
Paula, please. I think I'm showing the right part of the comic for this. Yes?
Yep, sure. So a couple of things. So I think for us, accessibility was multidimensional. And I think this is one idea that's recently, after this work, is what really stuck with me, which is how do you democratize accessibility? So within accessibility itself, there might be certain disabilities that are more catered to and certain that aren't. So for us, it was important to start with that because the first point that we make in the comic is that we're moving away from conventional tech platforms to these data-driven tech platforms. And there's already accessibility issues in the existing tech platforms that we're overlooking, that they will translate into our data, A. B, there's this double effect essentially of on people with disabilities because they don't show up in the data. So you don't design platforms for them. And so they're also not the viewers that you end up building platforms for, right? And it's not just a data issue, which is something I think we hoped would be a message across the comic, which is this is not an engineering problem. This is a socio-technical, political problem, right? These are probably not the most affluent demographics, which is why they might not be the priority users for whom these platforms are built, right? So it was extremely important for us to put that first, right? Because we're talking about, progress and innovation, but if we're leaving an entire demographic behind, then that's not progress, right? And that's one thing. The second point I guess we wanted to really bring in here was, so there's a prominent example in NLP where a lot of the work focuses around the English language and people don't actually care about translating it across different languages themselves. And I think there's a parallel in accessibility research where we're focused so much on, let's say, American Sign Language or certain notions of what accessible tech looks like, right? But these might not translate across demographics. They might not translate across countries, across cultures, right? So it was extremely important for us to, first of all, put this as the core message. And secondly, also then walk the path. So the entire comic and all the comics, all machine learners comics and all data responsibly comics are 100% accessible. So they're fully all texted. You can just read them through a screen reader. And I mean, we're proud to say the fact that it didn't work the first time. So we had Chansey Fleet, who's on the screen itself, tell us that although there's alt text, it's not rendering in the right order, right? And I think the idea is that this is something that we all need to think about. We might not be experts, but it's our responsibility to make sure we put it in there. And it's not a medal that we get saying this comic is accessible. It needs to be the norm. Like an unaccessible comic needs to make the news, but all comics need to be accessible, right? So for us, both elements were extremely important. I think the third aspect of accessibility comes in terms of demographics, where we're talking about, we want this to be something that anybody can read, right? So again, languages are extremely important for us. So our Spanish version should be hopefully out next week. So that's on the horizon. We're also translating to French. We'd be more than happy if anybody is interested in translating to one of their native languages to reach out to us. But again, that's extremely important to us, because if we're talking about digital accessibility, then that needs to be inculcated in our work itself, right? So yeah, if there's any part of that question I didn't answer, maybe Julia, you can jump in.
No, I think you were great. It's difficult to make things accessible. This was the first time that we tried, and like Fala said, we failed immediately. Having Chansey Fleet give you feedback and debug your accessible version of the comic is not something that's going to scale. So one set of problems that should be receiving attention and funding is, how do we make this process easier? And there is actually a place for AI research here, right? I mean, we should be able to use machine learning to help people develop accessible materials.
Is it your sense that that is a priority at NSF or other funders?
The NSF is going to react to great ideas that come from the community. Mm-hmm. So I'm quite confident that if people came together with a proposal that uses technology for such an important topic, that there would be funding available.
Mm-hmm. That's good. All right, well, I mean, so if people in the audience have, we could spend this whole time talking about algorithmic bias and ways to correct it, and it would be interesting if we have time at the end to spend more time on sort of the relationship between law and CS in addressing some of these questions, and kind of how relevant the legal standards of equal protection are. I know that Julia, you and I have both been been frustrated that these communities kind of miss each other on some of these issues. So we can come back to bias. Julie, did you want to talk about this or?
No, I just wanted to show the piece where we talk about our understanding of some of the regulatory mechanisms, and we had your input, Ellen, as we were drafting this particular page, because it is actually very difficult to summarize things. Right, so this is our attempt at a kind of a preview of a volume that will deal more directly with law and regulation.
Yeah, right. And so so I think that the conversation around this was once you identify some risk in machine learning or rule-based algorithms when they're deployed in the wild, what do you do as a regulatory matter? So we see, you know, in the case of facial recognition, we see some jurisdictions just banning the technology, and that would be an example of the precautionary principle at play. Like, we just think this is too dangerous and too difficult to regulate. And so we might ask, you know, what domains should just not be turned over to, you know, significant algorithmic control? There's always the question there of the human in the loop, right? Or do you have, do you mandate that there be sort of, you know, epistemic modesty about the extent to which we can rely on these algorithms and insist that that there be human in the loop? And then risk-based, there have been a lot of proposals for risk-based regulation because it's one thing when we're talking about criminal justice algorithms and someone's liberty at stake and public safety at stake. And it's another thing when we're talking about algorithms that might sort of, you know, create an order for pothole filling for a city, that there's just sort of less on the line. So we can come back to that too. But I wanted to, maybe we can move to sort of, you know, who plays, we've kind of identified the problem, and I love the mirror, the various fissures in our way of seeing reality or in actual reality. So we've identified this problem, and in terms of addressing it, you know, we've got the programmers and computer scientists who are developing these models. We've got the businesses who are buying them, and also governments. We've got regulators and, you know, scholars who are studying them and advocating for accountability. We've got citizens and non-citizens who are affected by them, right? So, I mean, one of the big ones at issue now, which our last webinar was on, was how ICE is using machine learning algorithms and surveillance data to have a more aggressive approach to non-citizens. So, you know, I think I've just mentioned 5 different communities. So what is the role that all these communities, educators, right? Who plays what role in trying to bring more accountability and justice to these systems?
Let me actually respond to part of this question, and then I'll hand this over to Fala. And what we're showing here is this responsibility or culpability lineup. So we'll get back to that, but I wanted to actually go back to the title page and also at the same time answer one of the questions that we have in the Q&A that says that the comic is inaccessible to the majority of the population with an education below high school level. And yet this population is the most likely to be hurt by AI and algorithms. And this is actually the first and most important set of stakeholders that I would like to discuss right now. And the reason that I'm showing the front page is because it illustrates our goal of creating a nuanced understanding, most importantly among the members of the public, of the role of technology and society, navigating between 2 harmful extremes that are illustrated here. So one of these on the left is techno-optimism, that says that technology can single-handedly solve all problems that society has created. And the extreme on the right is techno-bashing, or extreme techno-skepticism, that says that we should just throw out technology because it's harmful, and any attempt to use technology for good or to mitigate some of these pre-existing or other types of biases is futile, that it essentially is going to amount to fair washing. So we disagree with these extremes, and our goal is really to create a nuanced understanding of this. And as I mentioned briefly before, we are working towards a general public version of the comic, and this is going to go hand in hand with another educational activity. So this comic that we're discussing today, as Fala mentioned early on, it relates and it follows the structure of the course that I teach at NYU on responsible data science. But we also have just started a collaboration with the Queens Public Library in New York City and with an organization called P2PU, Peer-to-Peer University, to develop learning circles that will inform members of the public about AI. And we don't yet have a title set in stone. It's going to be something like AI for the people. And it will not assume any level of math. It will be by design available and accessible to individuals who are curious about these topics. They will be able to come to a public library near them. We're piloting in Queens, and this is going to happen in the first quarter of this year. So February, presumably the first learning circle will be available, where people can come and in a few weeks, 5 or 6 weeks, come together and discuss these issues. And we hope to also have a comic that accompanies that material. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with the question, and we are working towards that as well.
Yeah, and if I can just add on to that, I mean, this is a nested problem, right? We have like a larger kind of digital literacy problem, you know, across all use of, including with social media, that needs to be addressed. In terms of public engagement with some of these algorithms, Julia, I know that you were involved with the New York City's algorithmic task force, and I've been involved with Allegheny County's algorithmic task force. And I don't know if New York did, maybe you can tell us, but I think the Allegheny County one has done a lot of community outreach. And so, and the one that the algorithms that you know, are sort of top of mind are the policing and sentencing algorithms. And the sense that I've gotten from those community engagement efforts is that people really want to know what is the objective? What are these trying to do? Are they basically trying to ration resources or you know, sort of increase policing? Or are they designed to decrease policing and to kind of like increase the availability of resources? And that, and I think that's a really interesting insight, is that in addition to all of the, you know, to some of the more technical aspects of what kind of model is being used and what's the data in and what objectives are being optimized, it's sort of at the high level of why is the company / government adopting this algorithm in the first place? What's it trying to achieve?
Right. And these are excellent points. And again, we need an informed public for this. And frankly, policymakers most of them are generalists, right? They don't actually understand technology, and the burden is on us educators and technologists to help them understand these issues. So one of the outcomes of the New York City Automated Decision Systems Task Force work was a report that we issued, in which the first principle that we state is that we should be using automated decision systems only when they improve things. And so not use it just because somebody sold it to us, but actually have the burden to show that the system is useful. Another effort that goes on in New York City right now, and where we have been very active to gather the public as well as academics, as well as other stakeholders to participate, is a bill that's called INT 1894. There will be a hearing next week on Friday the 13th. Oh, this week is Friday the 13th, exactly. So in 2 days. And this bill is...
Can you say the bill name one more time?
Yeah, it's 1894. I'm going to paste the link into chat here. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong link. So there will be a hearing on this bill that aims to regulate the use of automated tools in hiring in particular. And I'm thrilled that we are in New York City looking at a specific domain here rather than attempting to do something more generally, because I think
And it's government hiring?
No, it's actually any hiring in New York City.
Okay.
So we don't know whether New York City government uses tools of this sort, but we do know that private companies use them. And the bill has essentially two parts. The first part is that if a tool is being used in New York City, there needs to be a bias audit. So then we need to figure out what that means, right? What's bias and what's an audit. And then the second part is individuals being screened by these tools have to be notified first that they were screened by a tool. And, you know, surprising as that is still not a standard, and it should be a standard. And finally, they should also be told what features or characteristics the tool used to make a determination on their application as to their fitness for the position. And I do really hope that this provision will in fact become part of the law, and that we will get a chance to work more closely with members of the public to understand how to explain these features to them and how to actually get to a point where we can link these features with job relevance and where there is some actionable recourse that we provide, right? So what if you disagree with your shoe size being used as basis for a hiring decision, or your name being Jared? I mean, that's the anecdote that many people know, right? Jared that plays lacrosse is the best fitting employee.
So let me ask you a question about that, and maybe this is another idea. I don't know if it's a comic, but an FAQ. Have you, or do you expect to hear from entities using these algorithms that we can't show the features that were used with respect to this particular individual because there are hundreds, right? And so we can't identify what was determinative. That's one. Another thing that one often hears is we can't respond to these queries because they're trade secrets. And I think in accountability, both of these things, this sort of black box obscurity, even to the creators of them or the owners of them, and to the sort of nest of intellectual property and trade secret concerns that are asserted. What we and the advocacy community respond to is that you better find some way to explain, right? Like you better, this then should create an incentive for you to use systems that are explainable. And at least when it comes to governments, you should not be procuring technology that is protected by trade secret.
Indeed, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Falav, let me hand this over to you actually to speak about the snake oil angle here, because this is what's really relevant, right? And it actually is not part of the bill as it's proposed. And I plan to bring this up at the hearing the day after tomorrow.
Sure. So the entire snake oil narrative, we were inspired by Arvind's brilliant slides, talks on this. So essentially we're talking about, I think it links to your question, Ellen, about are there certain kinds of applications where maybe AI should not be applied, right? So in some contexts, no AI is the best AI, right? So we sort of broke it down in terms of when do these solutions become snake oil? And so Julia, if you can scroll down. So we wanted to juxtapose historic breakthroughs in AI. And I guess the most prevalent ones that we hear is about AI beating chess or AI playing chess or Go, right? But the fundamental difference in that kind of application and an application like Compass or the grading system is that the rules in chess don't change whether you're black, white, male, female, rich, poor, right? But that's not how underlying societal structures are. So when you're trying to apply algorithms in society, to solve societal problems, the rules aren't as drawn out as the fundamental breakthroughs that we keep quoting, right? So we can't sort of convolute breakthroughs in a very specific guided setting, which has nothing to do with power, politics, race, gender, any of those attributes, with these other application areas like grading, like policing, like predicting recidivism, right? So we wanted to make that demarcation between when does this actually become extremely toxic, where you're trying to fix societal problems that are inherently complex and there is no ground truth, which I think it also links to a later panel. We can go there as well. And it's not just sort of trying to learn these underlying societal structures, but also trying to predict the future, right? So it gets extremely murky. A couple more points linking back to your original question here about the stakeholders. I think for us, it was extremely important, like Julia said, for the nuance to come in, where even when engineers are building products and we're doing ethics audits, it can't be just this stamp of, okay, this is ethical and let's move on, right? So we also go into a lot of, arguments that usually engineers bring up about, I optimized for my class labels, my accuracy is XYZ, the model is good, right? But what is your class label? Is your class label representative of what you're actually trying to optimize for? Julia,
can you just explain what a class label is?
Sure. So essentially model targets are what we want the model to predict. So let's say in the example of grades, our model target would be, if we're trying to evaluate what a successful student is, our model target would be a student, and then class label would be probably grade, right? So now the understanding that a grade represents a successful student is an abstraction, right? We don't even, in 200 years of having the educational system, we still don't agree on what a successful student looks like. But in an algorithm, we're telling you a successful student has an A grade, right? So that there itself is an abstraction. And we understand in computer science, we have to abstract to a certain level, but you can't forget the fact that you abstracted away, right? The fact that you made certain assumptions. And when you've made assumptions, it's your responsibility to validate the use of the model under those assumptions, right? So in this page, essentially, we talk about a couple of very commonly quoted points that we hear from engineers, which are just counterintuitive to logic. Like even if they just sat back and thought a little critically about what they were doing, they would probably not bring up these answers, right? So the first is the fact that there is no objective truth. And any class label is an abstraction from what you're trying to optimize for. And it's on the engineer or on the designer to validate the choice of class label or model target, right? The fact that this is representative of the underlying social phenomenon. And if it isn't, then like I said, maybe the best solution in that situation is no AI. Maybe we're not there yet, right? The second thing about this understanding that all problems will be fixed with deep learning or with machine learning, maybe an engineering problem can be fixed with machine learning or deep learning. But like I said, we've gone beyond the sphere of this being an engineering problem. When you're sentencing, when you're deciding criminal sentences or you're deciding grades, these aren't similar to AlphaGo or chess, right? So these are underlying societal problems. And so maybe deep learning might be the answer to certain engineers in an engineering context, but not in the context in which deep learning is being applied.
And I'm just showing the portion of the comic here about deep learning being this hammer that is trying to get square pegs into round holes. And then in the middle here, you see a panel that I really love that's about all models are wrong, but some are useful, with apples, different types of apples illustrating what a model is.
Yeah, good. All right, since we're coming towards the end, I think we should I see there are a couple of questions. Hafiz Asif, in your experience, what are the major challenges in communicating these deep and serious societal and ethical issues of bias, privacy, and fairness in data-driven technologies via comics, which are short and humorous without losing seriousness? And are there any specific lessons you have learned which can help the educators and proponents of these issues to communicate these problems and issues effectively?
Fala, do you want to take this? You have, I think, a good answer for the first.
Yes, sure. So I think for the first one, I think one thing that we learned throughout making it was, for us, it was important to have the most coherent argument, but as broadly understood as possible. So for example, let's say there were parts that we wanted to really delve into fairness and how fairness notions of fairness don't work in our AI circus panel, but we had to take them out because it was too much. It was too much information. B, it wasn't conducive to a general reader, right? So I think for us, first, it's I think our objective of it being accessible to as many up and coming or new junior researchers was extremely important. So I think essentially keeping your audience in mind is extremely important. Like simple example is an undergrad course and a grad course would be different, right? So you have to remember your demographic A. B, I think what we try to do in this was have like an onion structure where there are certain arguments that might be deeper than how they appear at face value. So if you go back and see certain panels a second time, you might pick up on some subtle hint that's probably not obvious. So I think it's important to ground your underlying message with maybe deeper details, such that the casual reader can still get your fundamental message, and the more I guess experienced or a reader who knows more background information can still appreciate certain nuance points that you've made, right? And again, I think it's hard. I think the reason we loved doing a comic was that it allowed us to do that, right? Because art essentially is abstract. So we could put in these components that people could interpret differently without the overall message being lost.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, and then I pasted the link here because I didn't know whose quote this was, that it takes a lot of effort to distill complex ideas into something that is simple and short, right? And Paula, you said, and I agree, that you really can demonstrate that you understand something if you can explain it simply in a way that your proverbial grandmother will get. And so it takes a lot of time. It takes months to do this, but the upside also for us is that we come out on the other end understanding the topics much, much better. So for us, it's a very rich learning experience to be working on this. I can give maybe a preview of the next one, which is very ambitious. So that the next volume will be coming out soon. And it's called currently Fairness and Friends. So it's actually kind of explaining the connection between fairness and other important topics in political philosophy, so as to help alleviate this fixation that we have as a community on algorithmic fairness and bias. I don't know if you want to add to this, Fala, but it's been very difficult also to distill that material.
Yep. I want to build on, I think, a comment or a question that came in the chat about humor versus like critical, serious discussions. But that's the beauty, right? So we have panels about scruples that happen on Twitter amongst prominent researchers, but because it's a comic, it might be taken in a better light than it was taken on Twitter, right? That doesn't take away from the point we're making, right? I feel like if you look at any prominent satirist or comedian, it's grounded in fundamentally serious, dark, important messages, right? And to us, the humorous, the immediate humorous aspect that people assume from a comic is such a help, because we can talk about algorithms causing havoc in society without people having to put it down and not want to read ahead, right? And if the message of a simple message like there should be nuance, techno optimism versus techno bashing is not good enough can be in your mind when you watch Titanic because you remember our cover, or when you watch Rocky because you remember our cover, then our job is done, right? So to us, humor is our biggest asset because we're able to maybe make these connections with ideas that people would not associate with technical literature through these sort of silly, funny, relatable panels. So even the one that you're seeing, we're showing you Jojo Rabbit, right? So the last thing you would think to have in a machine learning comic would be Taika Waititi dressed as Hitler. But to us, it makes the point about how is our discourse happening and what kind of discourse we're participating in, right? So to us, humor is our biggest asset.
And there's some pushback on this that I see in chat that says that comics have been shown to not be humorous, and this is a type of bias we're exhibiting. It may be the case that some comics are not humorous. Ours is.
Yeah, I think so. So we have two questions from an admired journalist and an admired scholar. John Loring, the journalist, asked, how does media deal with discussions about AI ethics and the impact of algorithms, and what would make coverage better? And Joy Gualamini asked, what help or support would bolster your efforts to reach more general audiences?
I'll take the first question about media coverage. And I think this is, maybe it's a little a pet peeve of mine, which is why it links to all comics, not just this comic. But in Meet AI, I remember specifically there was a story about Amazon's AI that made its own language. And there's literally a panel there that talks about expectation versus reality, where the coverage that we heard was they made this language that humans could not comprehend, and hence they had to shut it down. And when you actually read the research paper, the language was just a repetition of words that at some point stopped making sense. So the image I draw over there is two super futuristic bots fighting versus two babies talking to each other, where it starts out as English, but because you're learning off of each other, it just sort of devolves into murmurs. So I think media coverage is a big hurdle. And I think if as a community we're able to critically assess how we present our work, maybe some amount of satire on reporting that's gone wrong is good, and comics could help do that. But I think media reporting needs to be fixed simultaneously in order for us to sort of self-correct that gold rush mentality that I was talking about in the start. And I think this could help. So if there could be humorous panels that make fun of bad reporting, maybe hopefully they'd think twice about being made into a comic. I don't know if that's something that would go on their radar, but we certainly hope so.
Yeah, I mean, it would be good if journalists had knew the right questions to ask, and that might be something that our communities could help them with, right? To ask about, these questions about features and class labels and audits, right? How auditable are these? How explainable are they? The question about what resources you guys think are missing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question, right? I mean, time is limited, and of course, everything hinges on your priorities. What do people like us, what do others in the community decide to work on, decide that is important? But it would be extremely helpful if there was also an incentive structure in place, if it was possible to get funding, substantial funding, to develop educational materials, to develop public engagement and public education methodologies that we can check, in fact, work in some sense, right? So many cities, many governments other than cities speak about the need to do public engagement and public education, but very little has followed in a way of support. And so if any of the decision makers are listening to this right now, I personally think that we can get very, very far with a concerted effort and a concerted investment in public education activities.
I just want to add that to the point that Ellen made. So about the other way around, where maybe we can help journalists. I think that's also one of the motivations where sometimes it's not conducive for the general public to write about tech, right? So I like the fact that since like Julia and myself and other people I work with, we're the ones doing this research, right? So it makes sense for us to try to put it in an accessible format, right? So I think it links to the second part of the question, where how do we get more of this work out there? I think recently we've seen a lot of really beautiful venues come up, and both of them are my favorite venues, so I just want to shout out to them. I know NeurIPS is having a Resistance AI workshop, and our comic was accepted there, so we'll be presenting there as well. But I love the fact that you have a venue that doesn't have limitations in terms of you have to submit a paper, right? So there, I think that's one example. Another example is a proposed workshop at iClear about beyond the research paper, where we're looking at formats that might be more conducive to present research rather than just a conventional research paper. So I think the community as a whole shifting to sort of embracing these forms of publishing as well would generally really, really help get other people involved, get our work out there, and sort of make this something that a lot of other people as well do.
Thank you. Well, I think I will take the last question, which came up in the chat. Unless you guys should read Kathleen Conkey's question while I'm answering that, if we have time for that. Bill McNichol's question about Trafalgar polling. So, we have all just experienced a dramatic failure, right, of bad data and possibly bad algorithms producing really bad polling for the election. And Trafalgar, the polling organization Trafalgar, did better than the other kind of more mainstream polling organizations. So Bill asks, is there an argument that Trafalgar's machine learning and algorithms should be made public because they are so affected by the public interest? And I think that, because it's a competitive business, this polling and actually the underlying data is pretty accessible, right? Voting records and party affiliations, that probably there's not a strong argument there. I think there is a stronger argument in other cases where there sort of is more of an essential facility for the lawyers among us, claim that a particular algorithm or data set it has a monopoly position in the field, and so therefore it should be opened up. Of course, what the owners of those technologies say is that, and so I'm thinking especially of the repeated sort of people have been banging on the drums for Facebook to make its algorithms more accessible so that we can understand information flows better. And one of the reasons that they don't want to do that is because they say if we reveal our algorithmic processes, people will just game it, right? And so it will do more harm than good.
And that is always an argument that we hear, right? Gaming, intellectual property, and privacy is sort of the trifecta of resistance against opening up the black box of algorithm and data. And to all of these, my answer is, let's talk, right? We actually need to understand how we can build algorithms and disclosure mechanisms that are robust against gaming. But to do that, the only way is for us to understand the current practices, right? This cannot be a blanket kind of an excuse. Similarly with privacy, right? The argument being made that disclosing data, which you need to do in order to explain whether an algorithm works and how it works and what it does, potentially can bring privacy harms. But we have developed, we as a community have developed technology such as differential privacy, right? That allows us to actually release statistical information about data sets without compromising the privacy of any one individual that is included in the data. So I personally now, as a computer science researcher, I'm quite hopeful that if our starting point in the conversation is that disclosure, transparency, allowing people to exercise agency is the basic requirement, that we can come to a set of solutions that are a combination of education and law and policy and technology. And that will take us to this world, and I'm showing here perhaps a closing image, where tech is rooted in people and it serves people, individuals, groups, and society. Yep.
Well, and this will be, I think, our final word, because Kathleen has posted a very moving story about 23andMe's changing their results for her in terms of her relationship with someone, or their assessment of her genetic relationship to someone. And I think this falls into that category, right? This is sort of like what the 1894 bill in New York is trying to address, right? That in the context of hiring, that people who are affected by those decisions have a right to an explanation, right? About what features of theirs resulted in the decision. You could imagine the same sort of thing applying to something like this, right? So that it's not necessary for 23andMe to disclose its algorithm for it to answer a question about why someone who was previously reported as a half brother has suddenly changed to another category. Okay, well, we are out of time. Please go check out Mirror Mirror and all of the forthcoming products that Fala and Julia are giving us. And I think, the final two words we can leave with is just talk, right, Julia? We need a lot more conversations about this. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and stay tuned for our next webinar. Thank you, Julia and Fala.
Thank you, Ellen. This was so much fun.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having us.
Pleasure. Bye, everyone.